Alright, let's go ahead and begin your test 2 review. Just like last time, your test will open up on Monday and will be due by Friday at 11:59 p.m. So you guys should have plenty of time to review and, search for answers and things like that. If you have any questions about the test, please let me know. Hopefully this review lecture will help. Your scores were very good the first time, so I'm hoping to continue that with the second test. So just keep up the good work. You guys should have no problem at all. So it's been a while with spring break and so forth since we really talked about the first topic which we're going to talk about, which is Congress here, and that was in week 6. So roughly over a month ago. So this will probably be a good refresher for your memory here. When we first started talking about Congress, we just compared and contrasted the House and the Senate. So I just kind of wanted to give you this table from the lecture that really broke down the main points between the House and the Senate. We talked about the requirements for both the House and the Senate. To be a House member, you have to be 25 years or older. To be a Senate member, you have to be 30 years or older. You must have been a citizen for 7 years in the House, whereas with the Senate, you had to be a citizen for 9 years. In the House, we talked about how they have 2-year term limits, so they run an election every 2 years. They have to run for re-election every 2 years, so both in 2012, 2014, 2016, and so on. In the Senate, they serve 6-year terms, but remember from the lecture that 1/3 of them are up for re-election every 2 years. So 1/3 are up for re-election every 2 years. So you serve a 6-year term, and then at the end of 6 years, then you're up for re-election with roughly about 33 other senators. In the House, we talked about how representation depends on the population of the state. So for less populated states, you only have 1 representative. For the highly populated state of California, you have 53. Texas has 36 since there's so many people living here in Texas now. In the Senate, remember, it doesn't matter about population at all. There's 2 senators per state, regardless of how big or small the state is. So even small states such as Rhode Island have the same amount of senators as a big state here in Texas, who also has just 2 senators. We talked a little bit about the constituency. There's nothing really you need to know there, but the House does have a more local focus, whereas the Senate has more of a local and national focus because the Senate is much more prestigious. In the House, you have a total of 435 based on the number of population, and then in the Senate, you have 2 per state, so 2 times 50 equals 100. In the House, we talked about leadership. We're going to go ahead and talk about that here in just a few slides. In the House, we also talked about how they're more specialized, whereas in the Senate, they're much more general. They're much more specialized because they have to serve on a lot more they have to do a lot more subcommittee work. They have to be on a committee. They have to be focused on a particular area, and hopefully that area is something that the constituents really care about, or something that is very important to your local economy or local interest and things like that. Whereas in the Senate, you serve on much more committees, so you have to be kind of a generalist, and you have to kind of know a little bit about each committee that you serve on. Whereas in the House, you serve on one particular committee usually, and so you have to be specialized in that particular area. Partisanship, the House is much more divisive. The Senate is a lot less divisive and a lot more collegial and a lot more friendly, and they have much more of a kind of banter and debate and dialogue going on. Rather than the House, it's much more. You get the 2 extremes, the ideological and the political battles and things like that. So that's what happens in the House. So if you want to pause this video real quick and look through this table, it would definitely serve you well to do that. You can look through, you can compare and contrast, and that way you're prepared for the test. And so that if there's a question about the House, you kind of know what's going on. If there's a question about the Senate, you know what's going on. So I'll give you an opportunity to pause the video right now. All right. With week 6, we also talked about the leadership in both houses. Remember, in the House, you have the Speaker of the House, which is elected by their own party. So if the Democrats dominate the House, then the House Democrats will nominate a Democratic Speaker of the House. If the Republicans own the House, well, then the Republicans will nominate a Republican Speaker of the House. So right now, the Speaker of the House is John Boehner. Since Republicans have control of the House, they nominated John Boehner to be Speaker of the House, or elected him to be Speaker of the House, and he has served for Speaker of the House for a number of years now, since 2010 actually. In the Senate, we talked about how the actual leader of the Senate is supposed to be the Vice President, but in all honesty, the Vice President is not around the Senate that much. It's a much more ceremonial position, and it's only used to break ties, which has only been done a handful of times in the history of the United States. So the Vice President, while he's supposed to be the President of the Senate, It's just a ceremonial position, and he's not really there that often. Instead, the main leader of the Senate is the President pro tempore, and that's just the oldest member of the majority party. So whoever controls the Senate, whoever has been there the longest out of that party, is the President pro tempore of the Senate. We also talked about the majority party leaders and the minority party leaders, how they kind of get the agenda going in Congress and how they create the dialogue and they try to organize the party and things like that, and present their kind of position on things and how they hope that their party votes. We also talked about whips, and whips are really important. Whips are the ones that get everyone kind of in line, make sure they talk to each member and see how they're going to vote and how they should vote, and if they can afford a dissenting vote and things like that. So the whips are the ones that really are very good politicians. They talk a lot. They inform their fellow party members of the issues and what's going to be on the agenda and things like that. So if you want to review a little bit more about whips and the majority party leaders and minority party leaders, feel free to go back to the week 6 video. It definitely wouldn't hurt to watch those videos again. But I just wanted to give you a general sense of what the leadership in Congress is, and so that if there is a question on the test, you're also prepared for that. So also with Congress, we needed to talk about redistricting because particularly in the House, the districts really matter. The size of your district, the constituents within your districts, how your district is going to vote. So redistricting is very important. And we're also going to talk about gerrymandering here in just a little bit. But remember that redistricting is done every 10 years after the census. So they take the new census every 10 years, and then they try to divide up the districts around roughly 710,000 people. That way there's roughly the same amount of people in each district, so that each person gets the same ratio of representation as other people. It's done every 10 years after census by the state legislatures. They're the one responsible for redistricting. They draw the boundary lines, and it's often much more of a scientific process. They factor in demographics, they factor in how that population is going to vote and things like that. That way the districts represent the party that state wants it to. It reflects population shifts. State legislatures are responsible for drawing the districts. And then we talked about gerrymandering, which is the deliberate redistricting around a particular party. They draw these districts in a particular fashion so that it represents, if it's a Republican state, they want more Republicans in Congress. If it's a Democratic state, they want more Democrats in Congress. And so gerrymandering is the deliberate manipulation of borders to try to have one party represented more than the other. If you need to review gerrymandering, I posted plenty of videos on the website. You can go ahead and look through those. And those are some really good explanations on how gerrymandering works. With Congress, we also talked about representation theories. Representation obviously is very important in Congress. That's exactly what Congress does, is they represent other people. And so we talked about representational theories in terms of the sociological representation theory and the agency representation theory. And I can guarantee there will be a question on your test, or maybe even 2 questions on your test about each of these theories, and it'll just kind of give you the definitions. So if you remember when we talked about representational theories, the sociological representation looks at the demographics. Representatives should reflect the demographics of the population in which they represent. And so if you have a particular percentage of a racial or ethnic minority, then the Congress should have that same percentage of that racial or ethnic minority, so that the same percentage are represented in Congress as are present in the population. So sociological representation can be very important. You want people in Congress that represent your particular views or have a similar culture and things like that. But other people subscribe to the agency representation, which just says that appearance does not matter, because doing a good job is the only thing that counts. Regardless of race or religion or profession or gender or anything like that, what we really should be looking at is that they're doing a good job. And so both theories kind of have some merit. I can see both kind of the sides. But for the purpose of your test, just know the definitions of each, and so that you're prepared to answer that question. The debate about sociological representation versus agency representation is definitely a valid debate. And should definitely kind of get some more attention when you think about how you want your Congress in your own personal life to represent you. Continuing on with Congress, we talked about how bills kind of become law. Remember, I think I posted the Schoolhouse Rock video, which is not particularly how a bill really does, how a bill really goes through, or a bill comes to life, I guess I should say. Before a bill reaches the floor for debate, it must pass through committees, and it must be well debated in subcommittees, and if it gets passed, and then hopefully if it gets past committees, then it can actually have a chance at becoming a law. But the fact is that it must go through committee first, which is a long process, and most bills actually die in committee. We talked about different types of committees. I'm going to probably throw a few of these onto your test, so be prepared for that. We talked about standing committees. Those are permanent committees. Those are committees which are deemed important enough and have an issue that is focused, or have an issue that has continued for a number of years, and so it needs to be a permanent committee because the issue is still present on the political agenda. These are things like transportation. Transportation is something that never goes away. Agriculture is probably something that never goes away. Energy, things like that. Standing committees are permanent committees. Then you have subcommittees. Those are specialized committees under the committee. They're more investigative. They want to get more of the facts and the research behind the issue and things like that. We talked about joint committees. Joint committees are combined of both House and Senate members, so joint from both houses of Congress. Conference committees, those are just when there is a disagreement about a bill that is in both the House and the Senate. In order for a bill to become law, it must be passed through the House and the Senate in the same version, or the same format, and the same wording. So if there's a disagreement about what the House wants and what the Senate wants, they'll call a conference committee to try to kind of hash out those differences. And then finally, a select committee. Select committees are formed to deal with a contemporary issue, an issue that may arise, a national emergency or something like that, a natural disaster, or you can think about after 9/11, there was a select committee on Homeland Security. They're formed to deal with contemporary issues that may arise, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Like I said, I'm going to throw just a few of these onto your test, so be prepared. Pause the video if you need to and look through these. Go through your own notes if you need to, but I will throw just a couple of those definitions onto the test, so be prepared for that. Alright, once a bill is passed, let's say it gets past committee, gets on the floor, it does not immediately become law. We talked about how it can be either approved or vetoed by the president. And we talked about the 4 types of presidential actions once a bill becomes a law. So this is kind of where the presidency mixes with Congress. Is once a bill passes through Congress, the president must decide what to do with it. First off, he can sign the bill. And signing the bill makes it a law. Pretty simple right there. He can outright veto the bill, which just means he stamps a veto on it, sends it back to Congress. If they want to try to override it, they can. Third of all, this is a kind of a special scenario that you need to think about. When Congress is in session, Congress is actually in session, and the president does not sign the bill within 10 days, it becomes a law. Now the flip scenario is that Congress is not in session, or it has 10 days left. And so this is the fourth and final scenario. When Congress has less than 10 days left in the session, and the president does not sign the bill, it is vetoed. It's called a pocket veto. The reason why it's vetoed is because he doesn't have to sign it, and Congress can't do anything about it because they're not in session, or they don't have enough time left to override a veto. So that's called a pocket veto. He just kind of pockets it, and the next time Congress comes into session, then they have to kind of deal with it. So those are the 4 different types of presidential actions. He can sign the bill, he can veto the bill, he can not sign the bill and it becomes a law if Congress is in session, he can not sign the bill and it won't become a law if Congress has less than 10 days left or is not in session. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions about those, please send those my way. I can try to clarify it. I know it gets kind of confusing. We often think that presidents just either sign the bill or sign the bill or veto the bill. But there is kind of a political situation in which he may not want to sign the bill, and it can either become law or be vetoed. So if you have questions about that, please send those my way. All right. So we kind of talked about the mix of Congress and the presidency, so let's go ahead and just focus particularly on the presidency. And this is what we did in week 7. We talked about the presidency. And the first thing we talked about was where the idea of the presidency comes from. And the founders wrote it into the Constitution into Article 2, Section 1, which states that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. And so they thought about the presidency, and they thought after the Articles of Confederation, which didn't have an executive, that we need to establish at least some type of executive branch. And they didn't want a tyrant because they just fought King George in the Revolutionary War, but they realized that some executive action was necessary to enforce laws. And so Article 2, Section 1 establishes the unitary executive, unitary meaning a federal executive, with power in one president selected based on popular representation in states as states. And this is where we get into the idea of electing a president and states as states, meaning the Electoral College. So, for the qualifications, they wrote out that he must be 35 years or older. We have never had a presidency that's 35. I believe the youngest is 42. He must have lived in the United States for the last 14 years, and he must be a natural-born citizen, meaning he was born within the United States. So, that's where we get the idea of the qualifications of presidency. Now let's talk about how we elect them. We talked about the Electoral College. Remember, while we count the popular vote, the president is not directly elected. It's not just based on popular vote. It's based off the idea of the Electoral College. And with the Electoral College, the president can win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote. So, the Electoral College is vote based on both population and statehood. Remember, you get one elector for every one U.S. House of Representatives member, and then you get 2 electors for every 2 senators per state. So everybody has at least 3 Electoral College votes. So states such as North Dakota, South Dakota, Rhode Island, Wyoming, Montana, those sparsely populated or small states, they have at least 3 Electoral College votes. Bigger states such as California with 55 and Texas with 38, those states are highly populated and big or larger in area, I guess I should say. How many electors are there? Well, there's 1 elector for every U.S. House of Representative members. There's 2 for every senator. So you have 435 based on the number of congressional members, plus 100 for every Senate member. So 435 plus 100. Plus, remember, we have the special case of the Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has 3 electors. So 435 plus 100 plus 3, 538. I can guarantee that will be a question on your test, so if you're watching this video, it's very good for you. You get a free answer. 538 Electoral College votes. We talked about electors that had trouble. Remember, this is the hypothetical misfire where somebody wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College. 1800, 1824, 1876, 1888, and then 2000 was the most recent case. It was a highly publicized issue where we had Gore, who had roughly 51 million votes, 50,999,897. Then you had Bush with 50,456 and 2 votes. So Gore had roughly 500,000 more votes than George Bush. But George Bush won the Electoral College since he won Florida, and Gore only had 266 Electoral College votes. Bush had 271 Electoral College votes. Therefore, George W. Bush won the election over Gore despite losing the popular vote. So if you need any review on the Electoral College, please send them my way. Let me check real quick if there's actually another slide. No, there's not. Okay, so if you have any questions on Electoral College, please send them my way. I can try to answer them. Electoral College can get kind of confusing, but hopefully you're at least familiar with the idea and can answer the question correctly on the test here. So if you have any questions about the Electoral College, send them my way. All right. Once elected president, we talked about the inauguration. It's on January 20th, originally March 4th. The oath is administered by the Chief Justice. We talked about the salary, or the perks of being president, I guess I should say. $400,000 salary. You have an expense account. You have a travel fund, an entertainment fund. You get exclusive use of Air Force One, the presidential motorcade, and Marine One, which is the presidential helicopter. We talked about retirement pension, Secret Service detail for 10 years after service, and your presidential library as well. So some nice perks to being president, including this. The salary is nice, don't get me wrong, but also the other accounts and perks and things like that. We talked about impeachment and how impeachment is not removal, and it's not. Impeachment does not mean removal, and there's actually a separate process from impeachment. So be sure to review this really quick for your test. We'll go through this slide here. Impeachment is simply a decision by the U.S. House to order the Senate to have a trial. So impeachment is done in the House. The House will vote on it, and then if enough Congress members select or vote for impeachment, then it goes to the Senate to see if he actually did anything wrong during his trial. Impeachment does not mean removal, and I have that in big capital letters there. Impeachment does not mean removal. It means a decision to enact the articles of impeachment, and basically an indictment, more or less. The House just simply needs a majority. The House votes by majority, 51%, to impeach. And then it goes to the Senate, which convicts the president if they feel that he is guilty. But they must convict by 2/3. So there has to be something really serious. For the Senate to actually convict a president, it would have to be something very, very serious. The Chief Justice is the one that presides over the president trials. That way each branch of government is represented, and that way we can ensure a fair court trial. It removes the president from office and takes away the pension. So if he's actually convicted by the Senate, it would remove him from office and take away his pension. You can be removed for office for a number of reasons, such as treason, bribery, and other high crimes, felony, and misdemeanors. Normally, I would talk about the three impeachment cases, but we actually did not get to it in this class simply because this is an online lecture, and your attention span for YouTube videos of me talking is probably pretty short. But if this was a normal class, I would talk about the Johnson case, the Nixon case, and the Clinton case. Johnson was impeached and almost convicted he was short of being convicted by one vote. We would normally talk about Nixon and how Nixon was going to be impeached and removed for the Watergate scandal, but he resigned before any of that could go down. And we would normally talk about how Clinton was impeached, but he was not convicted. And so we've had 3 different presidents that flirted with impeachment. None of them have convicted. So to this day, we still have yet to have a president to be removed from office. It would have, like I said, it would have to be a pretty serious crime for the Senate to actually convict them. Because impeachment is a lot easier than just simple conviction and removal. 51% to repeat, majority, 51% to impeach, and then 2/3 to actually remove. So much more difficult to actually remove them than impeach them. All right. We talked a little bit about presidential succession. This is just who's next in line. So upon the removal or death, the VP becomes president. Speaker of the House is third in line after the vice president. If there's a vacancy in the vice president position, the president is responsible for nominating a person to fill the position, and this requires majority approval in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And I also provided the complete list of succession if you're actually curious about how far it goes down. I believe it goes down about 20 positions for each cabinet level position. They are now in line to succeed to the presidency. All right. Probably won't be too many questions about presidential succession on your test. Just know that the Speaker of the House is third in line right after the Vice President. That's all you really need to know. All right. Also moving on with the presidency, we talked about the theories of the presidency. These are definitely important to know for your test. I can guarantee there will probably be a question about a few of these on your test. The first one is the strict constructionist theory, and this was the one that was president from George Washington to McKinley. And this is when they were really concerned about a president kind of being a tyrant, and so they really looked to the Constitution for guidance. It limited the powers of the presidency to those granted by the Constitution and those powers that were granted by acts or resolutions in Congress as well. So if the Constitution didn't say it and Congress did not declare it legal, then the president did not do it simply. It was not within his powers. And so the president was kind of restricted in a way to simply what the Constitution said or what Congress said they could or could not do. With Theodore Roosevelt, we get the idea of stewardship theory, just basically saying that whatever powers are not illegal, as long as the president isn't doing anything illegal, then that's okay for the president to do because he's supposed to be a strong leader for our nation. And so as long as he's not doing illegal, he's still kind of being a model citizen, sort of, then it's okay for him to exercise those powers. Then comes FDR, the next Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. And he has a national emergency on his hands. He has to not only get them out of an economic depression, he also needs to handle such things as Pearl Harbor and the response during World War II. And so FDR kind of looks at the presidency and says, well, I need to kind of bypass Congress. I need to get these things done. And so that's why FDR comes up with the prerogative theory, where we look at the president as doing whatever powers are necessary to protect the nation. It's in the nation's interest to have a quick response, a strong president, a strong leader. And so some people look at the presidency and subscribe to this prerogative theory, that the president can do whatever is within his powers necessary to protect the nation. And you can definitely see how this kind of took off with FDR, particularly with the Great Depression and with the response to Pearl Harbor and things. But it's also still very present today in terms of national security and the response to 9/11 and things like that. And so that's why the prerogative theory has definitely endured from FDR up until our modern times. So if you want to review each of the theories of precedent, go ahead and pause the video. If you have any questions about the theories of the presidency and how to approach the presidency, definitely send those my way, and I'd be happy to answer them. But I can guarantee that probably each of these will be on your test, because it's very interesting to see how the presidency has evolved, and it's very important to know how the presidency is involved and how people look to the president as in the institution of the presidency nowadays. We talked about going along with the prerogative theory and things like that. We talked about the presidential powers and duties. We talked about express powers, which are those that are particularly expressly written, I guess I should say, express powers provided in the Constitution. First of all, the president must participate in the legislative process. We talked about the State of the Union and things like that. The president has the power to appoint, remove, and supervise all executive officers, meaning the bureaucracy, which we'll have an entire lecture on later on in the semester. Power to appoint, approve, and supervise all judicial officers. He's the commander-in-chief of the national military and National Guard. And he also acts as the head of state, so he's our main figurehead in the area of foreign policy or in the international community. Delegated powers, those are those powers which are granted by Congress, not found in the Constitution, through acts and resolutions. The Congress has delegated these powers to the presidency. And then finally, the inherent powers. Part of the presidential responsibilities, they're not expressed in the Constitution, but believed to be inferred from the rights, duties, and obligations of the presidency. So just kind of what does he need to do day to day? We don't need to have an express kind of written law or Congress pass a law. It's just part of his daily life, his rights, duties, and obligations of the presidency. So those are his inherent powers. Treaties and executive agreements, definitely an important idea to remember for your test. Treaties, if you remember, require Senate approval by 2/3 vote. Executive agreements are different, though. Executive agreements have the same status as law, but do not require any vote by the House or Senate to go in effect. So executive agreements are just an agreement between the president and another nation, or the president and another leader of another nation. But it's not an expressly written treaty that needs a vote or requires a vote by the Senate at all. Overall, executive agreements have made up 90% of international agreements. And the reason why is because it's so difficult to get the Senate to agree on anything by 2/3 that they might as well just go ahead and complete an executive agreement to get things done. There's two types. There's congressional executive agreements. Those, remember from the lecture, are particularly used when the president needs some funds or some monetary help from Congress. So he'll go to Congress, ask for this money, and then kind of get the approval to complete this executive agreement. And then sole executive agreements are just simply between the president and the leader of another nation or another nation, without any kind of bypassing Congress, without any approval by Congress, I guess you should say, and they just kind of go into effect, and they have the same status as law. So sole executive agreements are kind of what I was talking about up here in this bullet point. Executive orders, on the other hand, are not exactly quite like executive agreements, because the main difference is that they focus on domestic issues. Executive orders are domestic orders which do not require the president to have congressional approval, and they're most commonly used to help implement legislation that Congress has passed. So if the Congress has passed this legislation and it's kind of a slow to start and it can't really get anything done, then the president can issue an executive order to kind of speed things up. And so this was really popular during desegregation. A lot of the southern states had resistance to desegregation, and so President Johnson ordered desegregation within the South to kind of get things rolling. I believe President Eisenhower had a number of executive orders to help out with desegregation as well. They have the same status as law, so what the president kind of says goes with an executive order. And if Congress disagrees with whatever's going on, Congress can actually pass a new law or refuse to fund the order. And so Congress can be kind of up in arms because the president may be seen as overstepping his bounds with these executive orders. And so if Congress feels that is happening, they can actually pass a new law or refuse to fund the order if they so choose, if they definitely disagree with the executive orders that's being put in place. With a lot of executive orders, though, they're allowed to stand because they kind of speed things up, they get things done, and it kind of moves past the stalemate that Congress often has to kind of speed up or expedite the process. And so the most recent executive order I can think of, I believe I talked about this on lecture, was with the legal immigration and President Obama. And so if Congress disagrees, which they obviously do, against President Obama's executive order on illegal immigration, then they can simply pass a new law or refuse to fund the order. And so that's just kind of an idea of executive orders. Executive agreements, remember, are with kind of the foreign policy realm and the international community. Executive orders deal with domestic issues. So that's the main difference. Executive agreements, foreign policy. Executive orders, domestic policy. So hopefully that makes sense. If there's questions, you can email me with those and things like that. We finally talked about, with domestic powers, also we talked about the military powers. He's the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. We talked about the War Powers Resolution Act. And I can guarantee there'll definitely be a question on this, because I feel like this is definitely one of the most important resolutions or acts ever passed by Congress. And remember, this kind of happened during Vietnam, where the president was committing troops during Vietnam and just kind of bypassing Congress. Technically, Congress is the one that is supposed to declare war. With the War Power Resolution Act, Congress wanted to kind of take some power back a little bit. And so with the War Powers Resolution Act, passed in 1973, the President must report to Congress within 48 hours after committing armed forces to combat. So the President can commit armed forces to combat. He just needs to notify Congress within 48 hours. Combat must end with 60 days unless specifically authorized by Congress to continue. And I believe I mentioned this in the lecture, almost always Congress will authorize combat to continue. They don't want to seem like they're not supporters of the military or that they don't support the president's judgment with military affairs and things like that. So Congress will always continue the fighting. There is a 30-day extension allowed to the president for troop withdrawal. Let's say Congress did decide not to fund the combat. Then the 30-day extension is allowed to the president for immediate troop withdrawal. Congress can call the troops home immediately if Congress passes a concurrent resolution, which they rarely do. But at least this provides kind of a pathway for dialogue between the president and Congress to that way Congress is informed about what's going on in terms of war and combat of our armed forces elsewhere. War powers are not just used abroad either. Remember, we talked about domestic war powers. The National Guard can be deployed. Then we also talked about the U.S. Patriot Act and how really we've kind of been taking this kind of war mentality in terms of in counterterrorism mentality, even here domestically in terms of internet surveillance and things like that. So the USA Patriot Act is the one that is the act that allowed the federal government to spy on our, or to conduct surveillance, I guess I should say, on our internet records and our phone records and things like that, in the name of counterterrorism. And so that's why domestic war powers are very important. We often think of war powers just abroad, but war powers are also used here at home as well. So hopefully that was a good overview of the military powers of the presidency. I know I may kind of jumbled that and rambled on a little bit. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them to me. But the War Powers Resolution Act is a definitely important act because it kind of contradicts our Constitution, what's going on, and provides the presidency a pathway to really control the military and things like that. All right. Finally, with the presidency, veto powers, we talked about executive veto, direct veto, we talked about pocket veto, and then the line item veto. The line item veto is where the president just goes through a bill and crosses out what he doesn't like. Well, this was ruled unconstitutional by Clinton versus New York, and so the line item veto does not exist. The only types of veto powers that exist are the four main ones that we talked about on week 6 of the Congress. So if you need to review those, go back right now. And so I'll just kind of skip this here. You should probably know enough about the veto powers by now that you guys should be able to answer correctly on the test, hopefully. All right, finally. Trying to get through the presidency. It's long. There's a lot to the presidency. So I understand that, but the majority of your questions probably will be about the presidency on the test, so be prepared for that. All right, week 8 and 10. We talked about campaigns, elections, and voting. It was supposed to only be week 8, but I decided to go ahead and make it into 2 lectures with week 8 and week 10. So first off, we'll start with week 8 when we talked about campaigns and elections. We talked about 2 different types of elections. There's the primary election and then the general election. And remember, in the primary election, you have 2 people of the same party that are seeking the nomination of the party. And so you have Republican versus Republican, and you have Democrat versus Democrat. And so that's the primary. And we're with Ted Cruz most recently announcing that he's going to run for the Republican primary. You're going to see a lot of media attention about the presidential primaries. You're going to have Democrats versus Democrats and Republicans versus Republicans all competing for the presidential primary to win the nomination of their respective parties for the presidential general election. And the general election happens after the primary elections, where they've nominated their candidate for that party, and then they go on to the general election, where they will be seeking office against opponents of another party. So you have the Republican nominee versus the Democratic nominee. And this isn't just for presidential elections, it's for all types of elections. Even here in Texas, we have governor primaries, we have senator primaries, lieutenant governor primaries, things like that. So there's always a primary election, and it happens before the general election. So primary, you have 2 people of the same party against each other, and then the general election, you have people of different parties fighting against each other. Runoff elections, we talked about that. If no candidate wins by the rules, well, then we'll just have a runoff election to see who can win. We also talked about caucuses. Caucuses are part of the primary election. Caucuses is just where all party members meet at a set date and time to decide the nomination of their party. And this is for presidential elections only. There's no caucuses within statewide elections. Remember when we talked about the primaries versus the general elections? We talked about how in the primary elections, you have what's kind of called the pull towards extremism. So in the primary elections, you have the Democrats and the Republicans both going for what they would call their base. This is where most Republican voters lie, and this is where most Democratic voters lie, right here. And so in the primary election, you have the Democratic candidates trying to garner the most votes from their own activists, from their own party members. And so Republicans are trying to gain the votes right here. Democrats are trying to gain the votes right here. And so you have this pull towards extremism. Who can be more Democratic and who can be more Republican than the other? And so you get all these people saying these kind of crazy things in the primaries because they're trying to gain the votes of that party. But then as soon as they get nominated, it's a complete flip. And that's where the general elections garner this push towards moderation. Because in the general election, a lot more voters are more moderate. They're the ones that they're not as extreme as the voters that vote in the primaries. These are your everyday kind of people. And so the Democratic candidate that was going this way and the Republican candidate that was going this way are now trying to go inward towards where the most votes are. It's the push towards moderation. They want to seem like the average guy that you would have a beer with, or they want to seem like they understand what the average person is going through. They no longer want to gain the votes of their respective parties, so they're pushing towards moderation to where they can gain the most votes from. These people that voted down here in the Democratic primary and these people that voted in the Republican primary, they're still going to vote for Democrats and Republicans. Now what needs to happen is that the candidates need to gain these votes right here. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. The push towards extremism, the pull towards extremism, and the push towards moderation. I can guarantee will be on your test. Hopefully that makes sense, and maybe you can apply it when you follow the presidential primaries next year. You can see how the Democrats and the Republicans are both trying to pull towards extremism to win the nomination, but then watch them in the general election when they're going to completely flip-flop and try to go towards moderation in order to win the election. So that's why a lot of politicians get accused of flip-flopping, but you need to put it within context of whether it's a primary election or whether it's a general election. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you can apply that next year when you watch the presidential primaries. We talked about election dates and times. Election dates and times with your primaries, first of all, it's set by the state. So in Texas, we have our primary elections on the second Tuesday in March. The general elections, regardless of state, are always on a uniform date, and this is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That's the way it's written into law. Every general election will be the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So if November 1st falls on a Monday, if November 1st falls on a Tuesday, that can't happen because it's not the first Tuesday after the first Monday. I know it's a little confusing. Hopefully that makes sense. That's just the way it's written into law, so that's the way I have to teach you guys. The presidential elections, remember, they happen every 4 years. The House of Representatives, they're up for election every 2 years, so whether it's a presidential election or a midterm election, they're up for election every 2 years. The Senate, they're up for election every 6 years, and they have staggered one-third. They stagger it so that 1/3 are up for election every 2 years. And then governor, at least here in Texas, is every 4 years opposite the president. So if opposite the presidential election, during the midterm elections, that's when the governor elections happen. All right. Electoral College, we kind of already talked about that a little bit. We talked about Nebraska and Maine and how that would be different. If no majority decides the Electoral College, then the House of Representatives decides who wins the presidential election. And then in that case, also the vice president would be selected by the Senate. We talked about swing states and how important swing states are. So those are your states such as Florida, Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina sometimes. We also talked about the incumbency effect, where roughly 92% of Congress members are reelected every time. Remember when we talked about Congress, we also talked about how Congress is very, very unpopular, but somehow they get reelected at 92%. So it's kind of a hate Congress, love your congressman attitude. And so this incumbency effect really has a lot of people worried because we hate Congress so much and they're not getting anything done, but we reelect our own officials at a 92% rate. We also talked about how presidential approval really matters in elections also. If your president is doing well, it's a high likelihood that they're going to get reelected. And it all boils down to the economy. Remember, if the economy is growing, if the GDP grows by at least 2.6% in the second quarter of that election year, the incumbent will win. If GDP growth is less than 1.5%, the incumbent loses. So the economy really helps your election chance, and also the incumbency effect also really helps your election chance as well. All right. 3 basic strategies of campaigns and elections include the party-centered strategy, the issue-oriented strategy, and the image-oriented strategy. We talked a little bit about each of these, so let's go through these. I can guarantee there will be at least a few, maybe 2, maybe just one of these on your test, so be prepared. The party-centered strategy is, remember, the contract with America. What can we as Democrats, what can we as Republicans offer America? It's much more of a united front kind of position, so Democrats will present themselves as Democrats. And they'll work with fellow Democrats and often campaign with them as well. And it also just focuses on the party platforms as well and what they can provide for America. So that's why it's called the contract with America. Issue-oriented strategy, it's the economy, stupid. If the economy is doing well, that's what matters. If the economy is doing bad, well, we probably need to focus on a different issue. So it's all about the issues, and each campaign will try to tackle a particular issue. The image-oriented strategy is kind of this post-partisan, let's move beyond the party-centered strategy, let's move beyond the issues, let's just work with each other and get stuff done, basically. And so this campaign strategy became really popular during the Obama campaign in 2008 with his slogan that was really popular, "Yes, we can." He didn't really attack the Republicans. He didn't really attack the state of the economy or particular issues, things like that. He just wanted to kind of focus the campaign on himself and moving past partisan politics. He presented himself as someone that could work across the aisle, be bipartisan be bipartisan within the government, and get things done. So it's this post-partisan kind of idea, image issue focused strategy, basically. So you have the party-centered strategy, which focuses on the party and the contract of America, the issue-oriented strategy, which focuses on a particular issue, particularly usually the economy, and then the image-oriented strategy, which moves beyond partisan politics and focuses on a bright future and kind of hope and change and things like that. Conducting a campaign, we talked about on the campaign trail how candidates will spend most of their time in swing states where their support for candidates is about equal, so they need to sway more voters. Or they will also spend time in states where their support is the greatest, especially for fundraising. Fundraising is very, very important. Tackling the issues, we talked about stump speeches, which are just 20-minute speeches that are kind of pre-made, prefabricated, that kind of express a candidate's beliefs on key issues, but it's well written out and kind of well rehearsed. Negative campaigning, we also talked about that as well. Negative campaigning, most campaigns use negative campaign ads now. They attack the candidate's weaknesses, and 90% of ads, if you remember, are at some point negative, and the public doesn't like it, but it works. We talked about the negative campaigning, particularly because it comes from super PACs and the money that is involved in elections. So this is where the Federal Elections Commission comes in. Remember, the Federal Elections Commission is the federal commission, the federal agency, charged with monitoring campaign finance and the legality of campaign finance. We talked about public financing versus private financing. Remember, public financing, they take money from taxpayers' money, or money that the taxpayers willingly signed off on, the $3 per taxpayer basically, and they'll take the public financing and then they're set to a particular set of restrictions. But with the private financing, they're not. Private financing, they can raise, thanks to the implementation of super PACs due to Citizens United, they can raise unlimited amounts of money, basically. Individual limits, though, were the first original campaign contribution. Individual limits are set to $25,000 per campaign per election, both primary and general, $5,000 per political action committee per year, and then $30,800 per political party per year. That's small money compared to what we talked about with super PACs and PACs. That's individual limits. But let's look at PACs. PACs come about thanks to the Tillman Act and the Taft-Hartley Act. The Tillman Act barred corporations from donating to political campaigns. The Taft-Hartley Act barred unions from donating to political campaigns. They were subject to limits $5,000 per election. Remember, corporations and unions couldn't donate directly to campaigns anymore, so what they did was set up political action committees as sort of a loophole. If you remember from the lecture, the original lecture, they set up these political action committees as sort of a loophole, and they were subject to $5,000 per election. Enter kind of a new loophole and a new way of thinking with these 527s and these 501c4s. With these 527s and these 501c4s, there's no limit on donations, and also there's no limit on spending. The only stipulation is that they must not coordinate with parties or candidates, and they cannot explicitly advocate a vote for a candidate. So you have the political action committees, but then enter the super PACs with the 527s and the 501c4s. The 527s, remember, are explicitly political organizations, and they do have certain donor disclosure requirements. The 501c4s, however, are social welfare organizations. In other words, they're nonprofit organizations. They're nonprofit organizations, and so that political activity cannot be their main activity. They must be less than 50% of their total activity. They must be involved with other educational activities, and these can be something really, really vague, these educational activities. They can be pretty much anything you want to think of. The plus side to these 501c4s is they have no donor disclosure requirements. And so this is where corporations really kind of latched onto these 501c4s. No donor disclosure requirements. So famous brands such as, say, Walmart or Target or anything like that, they're not going to be linked back to a particular political campaign if they simply donate to these 501c4s. So the combination of 501c4s and 527s create the super PACs, independent expenditure-only committees, meaning basically they do advertising. That's more or less what it means. Super PACs may raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, associations, and individuals. Super PACs spend unlimited sums of money to overtly advocate for or against political candidates. Super PACs must report their donors to the federal election committees. However, if you remember from the Colbert videos, hopefully you guys watched those last week, the Colbert videos showed you how they can just set up a shell corporation, funnel the money through the shell corporation, and then the shell corporation will donate to the super PAC. That way, when they do report their donors to the Federal Election Commission, it's linked to that shell corporation, not to the actual corporation itself. So super PACs are prohibited from donating money directly to political candidates, but when they take out their advertising and things, they're pretty much advocating for a particular candidate, more or less. So it's not going directly to the political candidates, but it's helping out those political candidates, and in terms of advertising and just pure money and fundraising and things like that. So, the Citizens United versus the FEC is the court case that made this super PAC idea popular. It held that the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting independent political expenditures by corporations and unions. And so this is very important to know for your test. Citizens United, I can guarantee, will be on your test. Citizens United basically said that corporations are people. People have a right to freedom of speech. Corporations don't have a voice. Corporations express their freedom of speech through money. And so the First Amendment protects corporations and their right to donate unlimited amounts of money in the form of independent political expenditures. And this kind of spurred the creation of super PACs. So Citizens United versus the FEC, sorry I probably didn't explain that well. I'm pretty sure that Stephen Colbert plus a number of YouTube videos and things like that could explain it a lot better than I did. But for the purpose of your test, just know that Citizens United is the one that is the court case that gave First Amendment protections to super PACs or corporations that wish to spend money on independent political expenditures. Corporations are people. People have a right to freedom of speech. Freedom of speech comes in the form of money, so therefore money is freedom of speech. An independent expenditure is money spent by a group not connected to a political campaign, like I said, and it's normally negative advertising. This advertising must have been done independently, not in coordination or connection with a campaign, and you must never mention vote for so-and-so. You can attack other people, you can call them a serial killer or a baby murderer or whatever have you. You just can't say vote for Mitt Romney if it was a Mitt Romney super PAC or Ted Cruz if it was a Ted Cruz super PAC. You just can't mention vote for that particular person. So that's a lot of information. I know I kind of went through that quickly. If you have any questions about super PACs, Citizens United, or independent expenditures, feel free to email me, post it on the help discussion board, what have you. But I believe that hopefully you guys have a good idea about this, particularly with the Colbert videos. I think he did a really good job of teaching about super PACs and exactly kind of what goes on there. So, with the Colbert videos though, I guess I had one more slide on here. With the Colbert videos, we talked about how because of donor disclosure requirements for the 527s, corporations were really kind of cautious to donate. Instead, they created the 501c4 groups, which spurred the influx of more corporate donations. We talked about the cell corporations that don't have any physical operations. These corporations could set up a C4 in their name and then use any donations to contribute to their super PACs. It allowed anonymous donations, and unlimited funds as well. Congressional elections, I'm actually going to go ahead and skip this. I won't put them in the slides I post either. We've kind of already talked about districting. We've talked about gerrymandering. The thing to know for your test is this definition of gerrymandering here. Gerrymandering, that is the deliberate manipulation of boundaries to gain votes for a party by dividing up opponents so that the dominant party stays in power. We talked about this. We talked about how political gerrymandering is okay. You simply can't gerrymander based on racial lines, though. We talked about this already with Congress. State legislatures draw the boundaries. Apportionment is just the allocation of population into districts based on census. And districting, drawing geographic lines based on population. So we've already kind of talked about this. So I'll go ahead and omit these slides. You probably already know about congressional elections based on the Congress lecture and this original lecture as well. Oh, sorry, I went back one. Okay. Senate, 6 years, every 6 year terms, every 2 years, 1/3 of them are up for re-election. It should be good to go on these slides. Incumbency effect, we've talked about that quite a bit as well. It's just that people get reelected all the time. If you hold office already, your chances of getting reelected are very, very high. All right, voting. All right, so this is where we're going to wrap up here with voting. Qualifications to vote. You must be 18 years of age or older. You must have been a U.S. citizen. In the state of Texas, you must have been a resident of Texas for 30 days and also a resident of the county in which you live or in which you wish to vote for 30 days. You cannot be a current felon. If you are a felon and you've completed your sentence, then you're allowed to vote again. And also Texas bars voting from anyone who has been declared mentally incompetent. So you must be mentally competent based on a ruling by the state of Texas. And so if you have been judged to be mentally incompetent by a court, you can no longer vote. So 18 years of age, U.S. citizen, resident for 30 days, don't be a current felon, and don't be declared mentally incompetent by a court of law. Those are your qualifications to vote on Texas. The question on your test will probably be something like which one of these is not a requirement to vote in the state of Texas, basically. That'll be probably the question on your test, so be on the lookout for that. Suffrage, we talked a little bit about suffrage. We talked about how initial standards were set by states. And so most typically way back in the day, if you were a white landowning Protestant male, basically, that was your requirements to vote. You had to be white, you had to be a male, you had to be landowning, and also in many states you also had to be a Protestant. So some anti-Semitism there, I guess, and also some anti-Catholicism. I don't know if that's what it's called. Suffrage amendments, though. Suffrage amendments, we've slowly expanded suffrage in the United States through the usage of amendments, and also the Voting Rights Act. So the 15th Amendment is the amendment that dealt with race. No longer could you bar people from voting based on their race. The 19th Amendment was sex and gender. No longer could you bar people from voting based on their sex and gender. 24th Amendment is the one that got rid of the poll tax. You could no longer require people to pay money to vote or to pay this poll tax. And then finally, the 26th Amendment. The 26th Amendment expanded suffrage based on your age. If you were 18 years or older to vote, you could finally vote. And it used to be you had to be 21 years or older to vote. And the main idea here was that if you could sign up for the military and you could die for this country, you should at least be able to vote in the country and vote for the people that are sending you to war. And then finally, after the 26th Amendment, you have the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act is the one that gets rid of literacy tests. So as soon as the poll tax was abolished, many southern states in particular started instituting these literacy tests as another obstacle to vote. And these literacy tests were extremely, extremely hard. Normally, if this was an in-person class, I'd have you take a literacy test to see if you can pass it. And it's very, very difficult. So we've expanded suffrage and we've expanded the right to vote. However, there are still certain things that are going on in the United States which are trying to make it harder to vote. We talked a little bit about those in terms of the photo ID laws, restrictions on early voting, and then also the insane campaign lines as well. Voter turnout here in Texas is very low, and it could be a little bit because of the photo ID laws, but it's also because of some other factors as well. One, there's no statewide party competition. Republicans don't go out to vote because they already know that they're going to win. Democrats don't go out to vote because there's no chance of them winning to begin with, so why go out and vote? So no statewide party competition. Texas is definitely not a swing state by any means, at least not yet. And so with no statewide party competition, there's very little incentive to actually go out and vote. You already kind of know what's going to happen. There's little mobilization by either party relative to efforts in other states because we already know who's going to win. This kind of is linked to the no statewide party competition. Texas also has a low socioeconomic status, low income, low education, and so usually people with low socioeconomic status, people that don't make a whole lot of income or people that don't have a whole lot of education, they don't typically go out and vote. And then also because Texas has such a young population, they have a lot of people in the 18 to 24 demographics, myself included, I guess, and historically trends have shown that people aged 18 to 24 don't go out to vote. And so all of these factors are kind of hurting Texas in terms of voter turnout, I guess, because compared nationally, Texas has a very, very low voter turnout. And I can guarantee that will be a question on your test. No statewide party competition, no mobilization, no efforts by the party to get out the vote, low socioeconomic status, and then also the younger population. All right, so we got through everything. Sorry if that was really quick. I just believe that reviews shouldn't be all that long. If you have any questions about the test at all, about the format, about what's going to be on it, or you need to review some particular concept, be sure to send me an email, and I will definitely try to help you out as much as I can. Just be sure to take the test sometime between Monday and Friday and get all the questions. I believe in you, and with that, I guess I will wish you good luck on your tests.